Hello and welcome DragonCon to the BritTrack presents British Invaders. And today we are talking about Supermarionation, then and now. So we'll be giving a bit of a history from the very early days up to some new fun developments from recent times. This is Brian from Canada.
And this is Eamon from England. Hello, DragonCon. Welcome to BritTrack.
So, for those of you who don't know, Supermarionation is the medium used for a number of television shows produced by Gerry Anderson in the 1960s that used marionette puppets and gave us something that was really new and different and unique at the time and has carried on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's Super Marionette puppet shows. It's mainly based on the work of Gerry Anderson and his Century 21 productions in the 60s. These are, for me, these are very personal shows that I grew up watching in the 60s as a child of the 60s. You had a slightly later experience. You know, you came to them a bit later, Brian, but you've watched them all, or nearly all of the content now from the original run, haven't you?
Yes, I've certainly looked at most of that now, and yeah, it was something that I certainly knew about, and the live action Gerry Anderson shows like Space 1999 were around when I was younger. So yeah, it was really present sort of in a lot of markets around the world for sure.
And what we want to do is get to some Supermarionation stuff that's actually happening now in the last sort of 5 or 10 years. But before we do that, we're going to go back and do a little bit of the history of the whole Supermarionation project. And it goes back right to the 1950s television here in the UK, Brian.
It does. In about 1957 and 58, there were a couple of shows that are considered before Supermarionation. The first one was called Twizzle, and the second was Torchy the Battery Boy. And those were both puppet shows that Gerry Anderson was producing in the 1950s. And when they were first starting, it was a woman called Roberta Lee who came to him wanting to do these puppet shows, and he wasn't interested in doing puppets, but she was the one who was securing the money for it. So they were going to be doing marionette puppets, and the concept that she was bringing was that you would have a painted backdrop, and I think she would be the puppeteer for it, but the puppeteer would stand behind the backdrop and reach over the top of it with the strings for the marionette. So it was a sort of puppet box style thing, as you would see in live puppet shows and that sort of thing. And Gerry Anderson immediately wanted to do something that was more sophisticated than that. And he introduced at that point the idea of the bridge, which was like a gantry that would go above the scene. So the puppeteers, instead of standing behind the scene, would be standing way up above it. And instead of 2 or 3 foot puppet strings, you would have 8 or 10 foot puppet strings.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about some new innovations that Anderson and his team developed in order to make Supermarionation the success of the 1960s, and a success that's then gone on to last for decades and decades and be brought back again. Let's get to some of the specific Gerry Anderson shows of the 60s, because this is when not only does he start to introduce these new technologies, Brian, but he also starts to introduce some of the science fiction themes that have become so important to us on our podcast. His early shows, sort of children's fantasy shows,
Yeah.
but as it goes on, we get some real great science fiction shows, don't we?
Yeah. But what you had with those early sorts of things, once you had that that gantry there and you had the puppeteers way up above things, you didn't have to have a painted backdrop. You could have a set behind the puppets, and you could have puppet scale items as set dressing, and you could have some puppets closer to the camera than others. So even those early ones, compared to what was there before, must have been pretty interesting and pretty sophisticated to look at the time. They're pretty simple now compared to what would come just a few years later in the 60s.
Yeah, so in the 60s, we get Four Feather Falls, which is a Western show. But then after that, we get Supercar, Fireball XL5, Stingray, a great show for me. I loved Stingray. Thunderbirds, possibly, I suspect, the most well-known of all Supermarionation
shows. It is iconic,
shows.
for sure.
Yes, absolutely. 1965's Thunderbirds. Captain Scarlet and the Mistrons, a big favorite of both of us on the podcast, Brian. I think that's fair to say.
And a big fan favorite as well. It is one that you hear from a lot of people about it even still.
Absolutely, yes. A lot of people like Captain Scarlet. There's been revival of that in recent years as well, but in a CGI format. Joe 90, where the child became the action hero, putting the kid right at the center of the show. And then a rather strange show to sort of finish the Supermarionation era, The Secret Service from 1969. But Brian, you've mentioned the gantry, the bridge, that becomes a new technology. You've mentioned the fact that they can then get away without having to use just plain painted backdrops and introduce actual sets with great bits of kit built into them and great look, very science fiction, very 60s science fiction in a way. What about some of the other stuff that Anderson and his team introduced to improve Supermarionation?
Well, the big one that came in about 59 or 60 with Four Feather Falls was the solenoid in the puppets. And this was what allowed the lip syncing. So on some marionette puppets, the movement of the lips or the movement of the jaw up and down is either a little bit random, or it just sort of opens while the person is talking and then closes when the person stopped talking. And with the solenoid, they could actually have the actor's recording of the dialogue being fed into the puppet to control the mouth. And this was something that in, around 1960 must have been really quite something to see a puppet talking in a fairly realistic looking way that really matched up with the dialogue. So that was the next big change in the technology, and it was really a big one that would stay with Supermarionation for the rest of the time.
And on the British Invaders podcast, we sort of jump around in time to cover shows. So actually, at the moment, we've been watching one of his very early shows, Torchy the Battery Boy, where he doesn't have this solenoid lip syncing technology yet, and which I think you said, Brian, it's Four Feather Falls that they start to use that, and it is quite noticeable on Torchy the Battery Boy that it's not so good when the characters are supposedly moving their lips. And it becomes a real thing as it moves on. It just becomes, they can get these great actors, these great voice talents to pre-record the scripts, and then the puppets will lip sync to that. And it's fantastic, isn't it?
Absolutely. And that was sort of what made it Supermarionation. That was arguably the super part. And that was a big technique introduction. Another one that came a few years later was the use of real hands in close-ups, where whenever a puppet character had to manipulate something from something as as simple as pressing a button to something as complicated as opening up a fluid compartment under the hood of a car and pouring something in or draining something out. Quite complicated actions sometimes. They would have actors perform that with their hands, and you would have hand close-ups of real actors that would match up to the puppets. And that actually fits in surprisingly smoothly. It works surprisingly well.
And then, of course, we've got some other techniques because the science fiction shows start to become very much about vehicles and very science fiction high-tech vehicles. And you mentioned backgrounds because then they introduced the sort of rotating background idea to give the vehicles an idea of motion. Is that right?
Yes. Well, they went into the model sequences as a big part of it. So instead of looking at a puppet sequence, you would be looking at something that was done with models of vehicles and things like that were done a little bit separately. And they started to get into explosions. And they did a lot of explosions and did them for the time very well. They really looked very good. And one of the ways they would do things with that was that they would film at high speed and then play back at regular speed. And that gives you a sense of scale. So when you have these small model vehicles moving around, when you play it back at regular speed, shot at high speed, it makes them look much bigger and heavier. And it made for some really impressive model sequences that they were doing throughout a lot of this. And as you say, they had the rolling backgrounds as well, where you would have, for some of those, they did have this painted backdrop, but it was on rollers. So you would have a model of, say, one of the Thunderbirds, one of these flying vehicles, and the model would be in place, but they would be moving the background with these rollers. So it would give the sense that the model was moving as you saw the clouds or other things moving behind it.
Fantastic. And then, of course, we also know that for like an underwater show like Stingray, where the vehicle is a submarine, they had to come up with similar techniques for filming to make it look like the submarine was underwater. And they came up with sort of, new techniques for that as well, I believe.
Yeah, they actually filmed through a tank of water. So they would have a tank full of water sitting in front of an underwater vehicle like Stingray, and it would give you that feeling that the Stingray was in the water. Sometimes they would even have that tank of water have fish in it and have a fish tank with the fish swimming in there. And it gave you something that was really interesting. It gave you something that looked quite dynamic and quite good. And this was something they were doing in 1964 or 65. So it was pretty impressive to have these types of things being done then. And as early as I think about the same time, about 64, they were shooting in color, which was unusual at that time. On British TV, color sort of came in bit by bit in the late 60s, and it was really 1970 where most everything was color. So doing it several years earlier, that was a big deal as well.
And we've mentioned that these are Gerry Anderson productions. Gerry Anderson is the name most associated with Supermarionation, at least back in the 60s and on into the early 70s. And also, you've mentioned this new technologies, the explosions and so on, because one of the things we know Gerry Anderson was very good at was surrounding himself with extremely skilled talented people. And there's some great names associated with Supermarionation back in the 60s on, all around the cameras, isn't there, Brian?
Yeah, well, when you're talking about the model work, the obvious one to mention is Derek Meddings. And his work with doing those explosions was really impressive. And he was the one who specialized in doing the off-speed filming. And throughout the Supermarionation stuff, he was there. As Jerry Anderson continued on to some other things in the 70s, Meddings was no longer working with them because Derek Meddings went on to work on the James Bond films, doing explosions and miniature work there as well. So that tells you something about the standard of work that he was doing, that the team from Eon with the Bond films sought him out to get him to work for them.
And if you wanted somebody to design miniatures, to set them on fire, to blow them up, to have them capture other vehicles in complicated sequences, Derek Meddings was the guy, often described as one of the geniuses involved with Jerry Anderson and Supermarionation. And as you say, then 70s Bond movies as well. Fantastic. What about some of the other people behind the camera?
Well, I have to mention two of the people who were designing and puppeteering the puppets, designing the puppets and then using them. And that's Mary Turner and Christine Glanville. And they both did a lot of work with that. And they helped bring the look of the puppets that we would see there. And they also did some great work and were involved for many years.
And of course, for me, as you know, Brian, I love the music of Barry Gray, which accompanied most of the Anderson shows, particularly the Thunderbirds March, the Thunderbirds introduction music, Captain Scarlet and the Mysterons, Stingray, all of these wonderful pieces of music that just made the shows some of the most exciting things on television if you were a child watching them at the time. And of course, in all the revivals they've had over the years when they've come back. And I suppose before we move on, we should also mention, we've talked about the technology that lip syncs the actors. The actors themselves, some of them, again, some really great people doing the voices.
Yes, well, we certainly had people like David Graham and Shane Rimmer doing some great work on there with both British and North American voices coming into it.
Yeah, and Ed Bishop and all these people. And of course, David Graham still, as we record this, still with us, still doing the odd bit of work here and there. He does show up as a voice on a project we're going to talk about in a few minutes. So yeah, some great voices, the lip syncing technology, all these creative people working in this small warehouse in an industrial estate on the outskirts of London called Slough.
That's right, yes.
Producing this great work in the 60s.
But and course, there's a name that we can't leave out. And looking for great people, Jerry Anderson sometimes went closer rather than further away with Sylvia Anderson, who he was married to at the time in the 60s. She was a co-producer on a lot of it and also doing voices and doing them very well. And she was involved in costume design, and she was into fashion and brought a lot of that and did some fantastic work on the Supermarionation shows of the 60s and went on to be one of the first female television executives to be successful and do a lot of work as well.
And as you say, looked after the team, was the person who kept the production going, kept everybody, getting everybody in their right place and sorting out all the problems. She was a problem solver as well, wasn't she? So yeah,
she was a huge influence on it.
Absolutely. So the Anderson shows, the Supermarionation shows, they get syndicated, they get sold around the world. They come back at various times. They introduce new fans to Supermarionation. And we're going to move on because we wanted to talk about this Supermarionation revival. In particular, we're going to talk about a company called Century 21 Films. And there's one name, again, that's particular now that's going to be involved. Who are we going to be talking about now, Brian?
Well, this is Stephen LaRiviere, and he comes into this as a fan watching reruns as a kid, and while he was really quite young, becomes a documentary film producer doing things like DVD extra documentaries. So lots of documentaries about classic British TV, doing things like The Persuaders and things like this, but doing documentaries, small scale, about British television productions from the past.
Right. And then, of course, I think he'd made a documentary about Supercar as well, hadn't he? And then
I think that's right. Yeah.
And then he turned his interest into writing a book about Supermarionation, first of all. And that comes out a little bit before the films we're going to start talking about, doesn't it?
Yes, that was 2008. He puts out a book called Filmed in Supermarionation. And he is thinking about it after then. And then I believe it was 2012, Jerry Anderson passed away. And he decided to do more than just a book.
Yes, he makes a film of the same name, Filmed in Supermarionation, a documentary about Century 21 Productions, about Jerry Anderson, Sylvia Anderson. He interviews surviving cast and crew members. They did a remarkable amount of work on this documentary, didn't they?
Yes, this was not a DVD extra by any means. This was a feature documentary that involved not only interviewing people who worked on Supermarionation shows in the 60s, but they actually took a bunch of them back to that same warehouse/studio in Slough and looked at that location with this group of people who had worked on it decades earlier.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. And of course, not only did they find all the surviving cast and crew, not only did they find the actual shooting location, they decided they were going to film some linking sequences, both for this documentary and for another film project that they were working on. And to do that, they sort of had to learn how to do Supermarionation, didn't they?
That's right. So this was really the first new Supermarionation that had been done since about 1969 or so. And they were working with replica puppets. They did some things with Lady Penelope and Parker from Thunderbirds, and rebuilt that set and rebuilt those puppets. Had actually Mary Turner and many of the other original crew members and some original voice cast as well, coming back to recreate and do new footage of Thunderbirds.
Just so fantastic to have Parker and Lady Penelope showing up. And then, they use these puppets to link sequences in the documentary. As you say, I think they've got David Graham doing the voice of Parker. I think Sylvia Anderson was then still alive and able to do her bits as well, possibly.
Yes, she did. Yeah, she was there doing the Lady Penelope parts, and she was interviewed. They had, I suppose it was from the book, they had lots of video interviews with Jerry Anderson himself in there. They had lots of explanations. They had lots of original cast being interviewed, some of whom now are no longer with us. And yeah, they really put a lot into that, including this new Supermarionation footage that was really incredibly authentic.
Fantastic stuff. So this is filmed in Supermarionation 2014. It comes out. It is available to buy on DVD and Blu-ray. It comes with another disc, I think, in both formats, which also uses the new puppet sequences they shot, the new Supermarionation sequences. But they used them to introduce something else, I think.
Yes, this is Supermarionation, and they were introducing original 1960s episodes. So you could get the 2-disc version, which had filmed in Supermarionation, and also This is Supermarionation. So you could see one episode from each of those 1960s series, and you had Thunderbirds characters in new intros introducing them with new footage, and I believe they had Shane Rimmer doing voices for that as well.
Yes, I do. He does Scott Tracy, of course, doesn't he? Fantastic. So you can get those, and they are, I think, pretty widely available, Brian, and they are just fantastic, aren't they?
Yes, they are. I will give you the quick warning that if you get it on Blu-ray, the main documentary filmed in Supermarionation is a region-free Blu-ray, but the This is Supermarionation collection of episodes is a region B European Blu-ray. So if you can't play those, you won't be able to play that second disc.
And I'll just mention, while we're at it, another very short 30-minute documentary about this warehouse on the industrial estate in Slough, which was about to be finally demolished. And just before they did, they took two of the original crew, Mary Turner, who, as you said, Brian, designed puppets, operated puppets, David Elliott, who was a director on the original Thunderbirds episodes, and they took them back on a visit to Slough, and they made a short 30-minute feature called Century 21 Slough, which you can get, I believe, on Amazon Video. And it's just a nostalgic bit. It doesn't quite have, all of the Supermarionation linking that the other features do, but it is quite fun as well and quite touching.
Yes, and that, just to emphasize that point, they had filmed these things in the 60s in a warehouse. They built sets and built all of this machinery with the puppets with solenoids and wires going to them and all kinds of complicated camera apparatus that got more and more complicated over the course of the 60s. They were doing that all set up in a warehouse.
Fantastic. Now, after making the documentary, they've started learning how to do Supermarionation themselves, and they decide not just to do linking sections for documentaries and other films or introducing old episodes. They decide to do something quite dramatic and new episodes.
Yes, they wanted to do new Supermarionation complete episodes, and they wanted to do Thunderbirds. And it just so happened the 50th anniversary of Thunderbirds was coming up at that time in 2015. So they decided they were doing new Thunderbirds. And the way they decided to do this, I think, was quite clever because they were focused on the visuals, the Supermarionation side of it, rather than the voice acting and the writing. They decided to look back to the archives, and there were a number of audio recordings that had been released on vinyl EPs in the 60s. So these were like Thunderbirds episodes that never had visuals added to them because they were sold as audio versions. And keeping in mind, in the 1960s, you broadcast things on TV, viewers may not get to see them again. And if you wanted something that you could get and consume whenever you wanted, the way to do it was on vinyl records. So you would have audio. So they were doing that in the 60s, and they did a bunch of them. And they decided that they were going to do a few episodes using those original audio recordings with a bit of editing and things they needed to do to them, but adding brand new Supermarionation visuals to them.
And 3 episodes?
They did 3 episodes. And obviously, this is a complicated thing to do in terms of licensing. So what they decided to do, rather than trying to do a broadcast or sell it to a TV network or something like that, they decided to go with crowdfunding and did a Kickstarter where you could buy a DVD or a Blu-ray disc with, initially they were saying, one new Supermarionation episode. Well, the funding took off so much that pretty soon one turned into 3.
Fantastic. We should, I mean, you know, I think it's fairly clear that the appetite for Supermarionation shows and the popularity of Thunderbirds has not really ever gone away. And yes, it reached its target in a couple of weeks, I believe, didn't it, Brian?
Yes, it blew past and went, up to enough to do 3 episodes instead of 1. These were half-hour episodes they produced rather than the original 1-hour Thunderbirds episodes, because they were based on things that were done for vinyl. And that has time limits to it.
And amazingly, they filmed them back at the Slough again.
They did. They had the original warehouse space and their newly constructed puppets for Thunderbirds, the replicas, and they had their newly constructed sets, and they still had people like Mary Turner there doing puppeteering for it, and they even still had Dave Elliott directing one of the episodes.
And it's astonishing that they got them involved. And of course, they also had approval from Sylvia Anderson, from Jerry Anderson's son, Jamie Anderson, ITV, who of course owned the Thunderbirds rights. If you kickstarted that project, you got the discs and you can watch the 3 episodes. Over here in the UK, I've been able to watch them on the BritBox streaming service. We don't think that's available in North America just yet, to actually on the BritBox service there, Brian.
Yeah, BritBox service here, certainly in Canada, but I believe also in the US, does not have the Thunderbirds anniversary episodes, which were originally called Thunderbirds 1965. Those aren't on there in North America, and I don't think any of the other Thunderbirds episodes are either at this point. They may be at some point.
Okay. So originally Thunderbirds 1965, now I think called Thunderbirds the Anniversary Specials. And they're just, to have relearned how to do Supermarionation and to produce something that looks so authentic. I mean, there's some digital trickery in there as well as just the puppetry, but it really looks and feels like a 1960s Thunderbirds episode, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. And they were able to do something that was both authentic and also a little bit new as well, because they would take the techniques and move it just a little bit further in some ways. So we mentioned how in Supermarionation they would use real hands from actors for things. And on rare occasions in the 60s on Thunderbirds, they would even use real feet from actors, that sort of thing. But they put it a little bit further with Lady Penelope in these revival episodes, these anniversary episodes, where you would see sort of her hand and the side of her body, and it was a real person. So they pushed some of those things a little bit further in that way, which was really nice. I believe they also did some digital erasing of the wires, which, of course, in the 1960s, they couldn't do that. In the 60s, it was all shot on film. And in these modern ones, I believe the model sequences were shot on film, and they used digital video for the puppet sequences and would do a little bit of cleanup, removing wires and that sort of thing. But then they did the processing to make it look like 1960s film, which it really does look like 1960s film.
And they look great. And if you get a chance to see Thunderbirds 1965, the anniversary specials, they're really worth it. It's such a triumph for Stephen LaRiviere and his team to have pulled this off. So that's great. So they're now the people to go to on Supermarionation. And this leads to a couple of interesting sort of TV, I guess, commission work for them, doesn't it, Brian?
That's right. After that first run, they didn't really want to go back to crowdfunding again because of the complexities and certain issues they had with it. But there were other people coming with interest to do things with Supermarionation. And oddly enough, the first one was a company called Halifax.
Yeah, so that is over here in the UK. That's a building society, what you would call a credit union in North America. And they needed a series of ads, TV spots that they were filming. And they'd done some featuring some animated, sort of cell animated cartoon characters, Scooby-Doo, the Flintstones, that sort of thing. But they wanted to make an advert for this building society, Halifax, starring none other than Lady Penelope and Parker, two of the characters from Thunderbirds. And of course, who would you turn to in that situation, Brian?
Well, it was Century 21 Films and Stephen LaRiviere and his team. And as you say, they became the group and the company that was still doing Supermarionation, where the original Century 21 company in the 60s, they were the only company doing Supermarionation. Well, now we have a new version of that.
And we get to see Fab 1, Lady Penelope's giant pink Rolls Royce. We get to see Parker walk into a branch of the bank, the building society, and interact with humans. We know that this is a certain amount of digital trickery to make the 18-inch or 2-foot puppet look big enough to interact with humans. And then we get a little...
I believe that footage is the only time we've seen one of the Thunderbirds characters interacting with a human on video. There was that last of the 1960s Supermarionation shows, the Secret Service did do things with human characters and Supermarionation models at different scales interacting, and had some very strange things that didn't necessarily always work entirely, but they did do some interesting things. But this with Halifax was the first time we would see the classic mid-1960s Supermarionation characters interacting with live action characters.
And they not only did they film the advert for television, and it was broadcast, obviously, but they also filmed some in-house ads for branches to be shown, which featured the character Brains from Thunderbirds, advising people about how to, save their money wisely and, so on and so forth. So it was great fun. Stephen LaRiviere and his team doing that. Now, this is BritTrack. Obviously, your and my interest is science fiction. on British TV. But of course, crime shows on British
Yeah.
TV, another huge thing. And in particular, the prequel series to Inspector Morse, which is called Endeavour. And it's set in the 60s. And what happened for one episode, Brian?
Well, they had a Supermarionation show involved in it, of course.
Yes, that's right. For the episode Apollo, they wanted to have it partly set at an Oxford-based puppet-based TV show set and studios. In this case, it's not a married couple; it's a brother and sister who are in the production team, and they are making a Supermarionation show called Moon Rangers.
So it was very much the new Supermarionation team pretending to be the old Supermarionation team or something very like it in for television. So that was quite something, and is definitely quite memorable.
It was. And again, they've got people like Mary Turner, they've got David Elliott, the director, coming back to advise. You can even see them in some of the behind the scenes footage actually up on the gantry operating the puppets, as well as some actors who they taught to operate the puppets. Stephen Le Riviere, I think, has a little cameo himself in the actual episode. They produced this show called Moon Rangers. The puppets themselves, I think we know they can be up to about £5,000 to make one of
Something
these
like
puppets.
that, yeah.
Yeah, they are big, weighty things.
Yeah, they're expensive to do when they have that hardware for doing the lip sync and the like. But what this was leading towards was what happened in 2020.
So this is fascinating. Stephen La Riviere and his team are now the go-to people for Supermarionation. They have, learnt the techniques partly from old crew members who've been on hand to advise them and teach them. And I dare say they were thinking of other TV or film projects they might do with these skills. And then, of course, global pandemic hits. And so Stephen and Geraldine Donaldson and Elliot Pavlin, who are two members of the team, are flatmates in a very small London flat here in the UK. And they decide to come up with a lockdown project filmed in Supermarionation. But they also got a new title for it, Brian.
Yes, that was Nebula 75. And I think it's just so bizarre that going into the pandemic, it turns out that 3 of the key team members for Century 21 films happen to be living together.
And of course, they happen to have some of the puppets that they've been using on some of this other work, particularly the Moon Rangers sort of pretend show for Endeavour. So they've got the puppets, they've got other people around the UK who can make models of like spacecraft or sets and send them to them in the post. And they produced this lockdown show called Nebula 75, which originally was airing on YouTube. And it's a Supermarionation show. It's a spaceship 33 million miles from Earth. And there's a certain amount of charm and whimsy involved in the making of this, isn't there, Brian?
Yes, absolutely. This was meant to have really the feel of the sort of Thunderbirds or Stingray era characters and story and writing. So this was not the darker Captain Scarlet and the Mysterons kind of thing, or an updated what would we do starting from scratch now. This was very much meant to be like that sort of mid 1960s Supermarionation vibe. And they did it with a lot of humor and clearly had a lot of fun with it, but created something that was pretty interesting and really does have the look and the feel of an old Supermarionation show.
And they were even able to and allowed to use a bit of Barry Gray music from the 1960s. We should say that for Jerry Anderson's productions, by the time they got to Captain Scarlet and the Mysterons, you'd mentioned a technology, Brian. This allowed Captain Scarlet, the puppets, to have smaller heads and be more sort of anatomically correct because the technology had got miniaturized. But for Nebula 75, as for Moon Rangers, they've chosen that Stingray Thunderbirds large-headed puppet and stuck with that. Clearly, they've got a great passion for those Supermarionation productions, and they've got this remarkable creativity, ingenuity, and in lockdown, in this fairly small flat that they're living in, they produced wonders, didn't they?
Yeah, somehow they managed to build sets, and I know they were having people send parts of them to them, but they managed to build things in a bookcase. And we were talking about having this gantry or bridge that's sort of 10 feet above the stage. They were managing to do this in a bookcase and have some depth to the sets and have it work a bit like a Stingray or Thunderbirds type of set. And they pulled that off quite well. It was in some ways more limited. I don't think they had anything quite as big in terms of the sets as the Thunderbirds lounge and that sort of thing, but they had the feel of being on this spaceship in that type of show, so that was really impressive.
And I think they started with quite short episodes, but then did they produce? How many did they produce on all? Was it 8 or 10 episodes in total?
Yeah, they did. Their sort of first run of them was 7 episodes, and that was all in 2020. I think the first one was about 15 minutes long, and they gradually got longer. The last couple were about 45 minutes long. So they were getting into, real TV episode length pretty soon, within the first 2 or 3 episodes, as they gradually got longer. They did a Halloween special, they did a Christmas special, and then they did one more episode. They did an 8th episode in 2021. And this had the return of David Graham. So David Graham, I believe by the time he was recording that, he would have been at least 95 or maybe 96, and was quite happy to record this. And he was voicing a film director type character who was based on David Elliott, who was that 1960s director who's still done some work with it recently.
Dave the director, who looks like Dave the director, but has the voice of David Graham, who of course is the voice of Parker from Thunderbirds, a national institution.
I believe they had Mary Turner make a new puppet for that character. So they did reuse. Yes. They did reuse a lot of puppets they already had for the Nebula 75 production, but they did some new ones as well.
So this show is called Nebula 75. As you can tell, Brian and I love the sort of behind-the-scenes production details of all of these shows that we cover on British Invaders, particularly these Supermarionation shows. And for Nebula 75, we do have... The reason we can sort of like talk about some of the behind-the-scenes stuff is because for each of the episode, they also filmed a sort of behind-the-scenes look at the production, and they did it in a certain tongue-in-cheek fashion, didn't they, Brian?
They did like a comedy behind the scenes, doing it as if you had a 1960s or even earlier 1950s British reporter doing it. And they gave you something with a lot of character, but it really did have the behind the scenes stuff in there.
And it's great fun, isn't it?
It is great fun. And they now actually have a deal to sell those Nebula 75 episodes for TV broadcast. So because of that, they're no longer on YouTube, but there are some clips and trailers on YouTube. and those behind the scenes things are on YouTube as well.
Yes, if you've been looking for Nebula 75 recently, you'll know it's gone offline because they've sold it to TV. But you can go to their website and buy the episodes on DVD or Blu-ray, and they should be shipping fairly soon as we record. But yeah, you can still watch those great behind-the-scenes things, which are very funny. I mean, for when we get to the Christmas episode, you can see by that time they've managed to get hold of some flour. So for snow and so on. And for a production company and team who've made documentaries about the making of film of Supermarionation, they do it as a sort of tongue-in-cheek, almost parody of themselves in a way, don't they, Brian?
Absolutely. And yeah, they were really able to do a real production in lockdown. And they did have some other people come into it at the times when the UK was not on lockdown. And they had a number of people working on things that were being sent to them or doing post-production work elsewhere. So it wasn't just the three people in that flat, but they were sort of doing the core of it for that. And it really gave us something that was quite fun and different. So at least taking a look at some of those behind the scenes things and trailers and the like on YouTube or the Nebula 75 website, there's some pretty cool stuff out there for that.
And as we say, hats off to Stephen LaRiviere and the team who have turned lockdown to, they've used passion, they've used creativity, they've used ingenuity, they've used a fair amount of humor, they've produced more product, they've managed to turn it into a TV sale for them, so that's great. It's just fantastic, so well done to them. And all of this stuff that they've done, reviving Supermarionation, is just, it's a lot of fun. We're sort of getting to the end of our time, Brian. We should probably just say what we think are our particular favorites for people if they're going to check out one or two of the items we've talked about.
Oh, absolutely. For me, it's definitely Filmed in Supermarionation, that documentary. And if you can play the Region B European This Is Supermarionation Blu-ray, then that 2-disc set is a fantastic package there.
Yeah, it's great. Filmed in Supermarionation with the This Is Supermarionation extra disc. So you get to see some of the original 60s episodes from each of the shows, introduced by the puppets for these new film sequences. But the documentary itself from 2014 is such a delight. It's just a gem. So much information about the making of the shows and the passion and, the talents that went into them. The fact that Jerry Anderson had such great people around him. I'm a huge fan of Nebula 75. I'm looking forward to the DVD of that arriving. I love the behind the scenes footage. I love the fact that they've made fun of themselves and they're extremely low budget and they're extremely cramped studio flat, as they call it, yes. Or flat studio. It's just great fun. So any of those are great.
Yes, they've done some lovely work on it. So you have, as we say, Supermarionation then and now. This classic medium from the 60s, and now it's back. And that is something kind of special. That's pretty cool that they have that back and running again.
Yeah, just great stuff. Do check out some of this stuff. It is fantastic. You can get the discs if you're lucky. Some of it's on Amazon. Some of it will be coming, hopefully, to television near you before too long, but it's on discs. Such wonderful stuff to bring back those 60 shows and all the excitement that goes with them.
Yes, there's a lot of really nice stuff there, so that's great.
So that's about wraps it up for us. We hope you're having a great Dragon Con. If you want to find out more, we'll put up our details about British Invaders shortly. I think that about does it, Brian.
I think so. We do a podcast that comes out about every 2 weeks. We've been running for 14 years now, covering all kinds of British science fiction television and British television from related genres. We've covered, I think, well over 150 different shows now, from the well-known to the really obscure. So please check us out at BritishInvaders.com if you can.
And on behalf of DragonCon and BritTrack and the British Invaders podcast, we'll be putting our details up shortly. And we hope you're having a great con. Have good fun.
Absolutely. Thanks, folks. Bye.